the chat. So this is a discussion-based workshop, and we're going to be asking you a lot of different reflection questions. The chat is not going to show up in the recording, so if I read anything out loud, I'm not going to put any names. So definitely spend some time being honest during your reflections. And some general ground rules. Everyone has their own standard of what makes them comfortable or uncomfortable. If something is distressing to you, we definitely encourage you to take a break from this. Do what you need to do. But we're definitely going to have some conversations about sexual violence. So we want to give you that heads up now. So.
Okay, so we're just going to do a quick little icebreaker in the chat. If you can just post where you're studying abroad, why did you pick this session, and have you or someone you've known ever experienced street harassment? So just go ahead and type in the chat now. And Sienna and I can read out some of the responses that come in. Okay, let's see, we've got Copenhagen, Milan, Cape Town, Prague, Australia, Singapore, Barcelona, a lot of Barcelonas, a lot of Copenhagens. Awesome. Nepal, I see there. And if you can type if you or anyone you ever known that you've known ever experienced street harassment. So we've got a lot of yeses.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's a very common experience, unfortunately, and we're going to delve into that during this PDO session.
Yeah, so one of the kind of main uncomfortable truths about gender, especially for women identified people, is that we carry a lot of assumptions about what gender is, either consciously or unconsciously. So some behavior that is in the US might be taboo elsewhere. Not everything is, it's not a good thing to say that everywhere is worse or somewhere is better. Every culture has a different history. No one is better, no one is worse. Some things that make us uncomfortable as women in the US might be totally okay somewhere else. So in the chat,
yeah, so in the chat, if you want to type in, what are some American ideas about womanhood and femininity? Are there times you have butted up against cultural attitudes in your everyday life? Are there more subconscious moments or ideas about gender that you've noticed? When we did this PDO session in person, we were talking about, we had a small group and we talked about how kind of the sorority fraternity system at Tulane and how there's a double standard there, especially the way people dress on weekends during Mardi Gras, and also, how fraternities are the ones hosting the parties. There's pretty strict rules about sororities hosting and how that double standard plays out. So if anyone wants to type in the chat about maybe some things that they see in New Orleans or Tulane, that would be great.
One that always comes to mind for me is a lot of the messaging around safety, especially when going out. A lot of women specifically are told how to keep safe, how to watch their drinks. There's a lot of messaging surrounding that compared to messaging specifically aimed at men and male identified people. So does anyone have any thoughts about this? I think gender is always one that we realize we inhabit, but maybe don't think about all the time.
You could also come off of mute as well if you don't want to type it. I guess we can just go ahead, Sienna.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of other ones. One that I always notice is what in like different work cultures is expected out of women surrounding makeup. In my previous workplace, we were very much expected to wear a full face of makeup. It was not a explicit rule, but it was one that was very much followed. So yeah, so some other good examples, staying in groups as a woman if you are feeling unsafe, or that women shouldn't travel internationally alone. I think that's definitely one that I see kind of repeated or accidentally internalized a lot, where, in advising appointments, usually women will come to me and say like, hey, I don't know if I can do this. Out of a concern from safety. So when we kind of pull out of this US based one, we're going to ask you to think about your own personal experiences about gender in different contexts. Oh yeah, being alone after dark, that's definitely one that's messaged a lot. So this doesn't have to be a safety related one, just different gender expressions or different kind of rules about gender that you've seen in different cultures. So one that I think is always very interesting to think about is nudity, and public nudity, especially on beaches. This is one that's like explicitly a no-no in the US, absolutely not, but that's not the same everywhere. And that's what I've definitely noticed. Is, I feel when I am in a place that has, topless sunbathing is allowed, my first gut is like, oh, I internalized like, oh, that's not allowed. And then I realized, no, it is culturally allowed here. Does anyone have their own personal experiences where they've seen gender in a different way before? Um, Talking about uh, personal cultures where women might not go to school and instead get married, which is not something that's very common in the US. It's a really good example.
Well, I think something that's interesting is I've traveled a bunch in Latin America. And for example, in Brazil, for men, there was a really high standard of also male beauty and men looking like working out and getting their hair done a lot and eyebrows. And I thought that was really interesting because we don't really have that standard as much in the US, as well of like a male beauty standard. So I thought that was an interesting difference that I noticed.
Yeah. Some other one, going to places of worship where you have to cover up to a certain level of kind of like no shoulders showing or having to wear a long skirt. Just got that message. Any other ones? Okay.
Okay, and so while you are never at fault for harassment that happens to you, and it is the fault of the perpetrator solely, there are more safety precautions women identified people have to take. Why is that? Anyone have any ideas? Want to type in the chat or feel free to come off of mute. Okay, so we have Abby responded, women slash femme presenting people shouldn't be out on it. Wait, sorry. There's the idea that more feminine people are weaker and therefore an easier target. Yes, that is often assumed. We also have women are usually not as physically strong. Men from Kylie, Eleanor wrote, many men feel that women dress up for them and that they have a right to our bodies if they can see us / going out. If I'm wearing a dress, I'll be approached more. Yes, all very, very good answers. Tiana, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, and I think there's also when you kind of look at it from especially universities are about risk management. And as Jen again, just kind of in society, it's a lot easier to say, hey ladies, follow these instructions and everything will be okay than it is to kind of dismantle much larger systems of patriarchy. So we are going to talk about a little bit like what you should do in the moment. As we saw from the beginning of the chat, maybe, the number of people who have either experienced or known someone who has experienced street harassment, a lot of these responses are probably based in the US. And so this can also apply to you if you're ever at home, just in general, you're out and about. Um, but I think a big part of it is that when you're abroad, you are outside of your normal systems of safety, and what you know as familiarity. So in the moment, if something is happening to you, try to remain calm. Sometimes, depending on where you are, people are trying to get a rise out of you. Hold on, I'm about to cough. Um, You should in general try to ignore the harassment. This can vary depending on where you are, but 9 times out of 10, we definitely do recommend ignoring them. A lot of times they're trying to get your attention. If things start to escalate, being loud and firm in the local language. So even if you're going on a program where you have no language background, it can be really helpful and empowering to practice before you go. And it sounds, it might sound silly just sitting there to yourself saying like, no, stop it, go away in whatever your host language is. But having that already kind of practiced in your brain will make it a lot easier to say in the moment. Always try to get to a safe place, especially if things do start to escalate. We really recommend trying to go to a public safe place and not all the way home. And so that might be a coffee shop, a bookstore, just somewhere where you can duck in and feel safe, especially if you are being followed. It's not very safe to lead them to your home just in case something does happen. And if things are really, really escalating, do call the police and already know the number of where the emergency number, the equivalent of 911, wherever you are going. It's not likely to be 911 where you're going, and it's going to change depending on where you are, but know it in advance so that if something does happen, you can quickly call the police.
Victim blaming is the act of holding the victim of a crime or a wrongful act partially or entirely at fault for what happened to them. For example, if your dorm room was robbed, the first question people may ask is whether you locked the door. Kind of going back to what we were talking about universities being about risk management, it is a lot easier to tell women, make sure you dress appropriately or you don't walk alone at night than it is to kind of call out the culture of patriarchy and sexism. And yeah, that is the definition of victim blaming.
Yeah, and I think this is one is really important to know before you go because some cultures, maybe more than others, are likely to believe the perpetrator rather than the victim, and that can be a culturally embedded attitude. And other times it might just be that the perpetrator might not just believe that they are doing what is actually sexual harassment. So at the end of the day, it is never your fault, and it is always the fault of the perpetrator. Progress. Regardless of whatever reporting systems say, whatever cultural norms say, it is never your fault. So in general, some methods to minimize and mitigate street harassment, like we do wish we didn't have to have this portion of the presentation. In an ideal world, we would not. But one of the things that definitely helps is researching the culture prior to traveling. Travel.state.gov does have a general kind of overview of wherever you're going. They do have a page that's specifically for women identified travelers. you should research local laws and start to begin researching what those expectations of gender are wherever you're going. One other thing that I heard as a recommendation from a previous student who attended this was researching different feminist groups in the area they're going. To the student, this is a really empowering thing to try to understand gender a little bit more deeply through listening to activists in that host country. So that's another one that can be helpful.
Okay, so methods to minimize and mitigate street harassment. Dress like locals, walk with a friend or in a small group, practice situational awareness, walk confidently and with purpose. Kind of reiterating what Sienna was saying, it is one of those things where, we wish that we didn't have to employ these methods to minimize street harassment. But I think these are really useful things to know. For example, when I was traveling in Latin America, it's actually quite common. I'm thinking of example, especially in Mexico, for women to wear jeans and not to wear like shorts or skirts or dresses that are very revealing. So it kind of you stick out more, and you're gonna be more you're gonna get catcalled more, and taxis will honk at you more if you do dress like that. And so I quickly learned to not dress like that, right, out of a safety concern. And yeah, I think all of these are really important. Walk confidently and with purpose. In the last video, I told an example of when I was in Brazil. I remember that there were two French exchange students, both named Valentine, and one Valentine, he was kind of like a bit of like a skinny, nerdy guy, and kind of held himself in a anxious and shy way. The other Valentine, he kind of walked with a lot more confidence and self-possession. And the skinny Valentine, he actually was robbed, I'd say about 3 times, including on the first day on his way to the airport. So, it's not that that's always what it is, but you don't want to make yourself an easy target. And I've actually solo traveled across Latin America, and I've never, thank God, had any issues with being robbed or anything like that. And I've always tried to, walk with confidence or act like I know where I'm going, and I don't pull my phone out, in like a busy intersection. So there are small tips like that that can help keep you safe. Sienna, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, a lot of these kind of tips also apply to just general petty theft. Trying one of the things I always do when I'm going somewhere that maybe I'd be at a slightly higher chance of having my like phone snatched, is always like, if I'm out, have Google Maps, but look at it and do the street view, and kind of see what does it look like when I turn right, put it back in my pocket, and then set off. And so, yeah, a lot of this is also just like street safety. At the end of the day, we don't want you to kind of be living in this pit of anxiety of, oh no, what's going to happen next? What's going to happen? What's going to happen? We want you to be kind of in the zone of alert and aware. We just don't want you to be letting your guard down completely, but we also don't want you to be, anxious wreck all the time because of your safety. So in terms of long-term self-care, everyone responds differently. Sometimes it's the repetition of street harassment that can be the more taxing thing rather than a one-off event. And self-care is important, and this applies whether it's about street harassment or just generally in studying abroad itself. Studying abroad can be hard, and repeated acts of street harassment can just make it harder. So you are in a new environment. You should have good self-care established before you go, regardless of your gender. But some of the things that I personally like and usually recommend is 4-7-8 breathing. And this is to help you calm down in the moment. So breathing in for 4, holding for 7, and letting out for 8, so that you can respond without your body kind of being in that freak out zone. I think there's validity to having safe locations that are, physically safe, that store that's open really late at night, that's on your commute back home, but also emotionally safe. If you really like going to the gym, having one that's, you get there, you find the one that you really like, going all the time, having one that's a location that's really healing to you can help. It can be outside, it can be your favorite cafe. And I think finding some outlets to kind of manage stress, anxiety, and culture shock is also very needed. So identifying those before you go is one of my very, very top study abroad tips, so that you're not having to navigate all of, wrestling with these feelings, all of these different things, and also culture shock. Knowing before you go is very helpful.
Okay, so utilizing resources. Talk to your program provider slash host institutions for resources. There are host country specific materials and English speaking counselors, usually definitely most of your study abroad programs will talk to you about safety concerns and resources. Most study abroad programs can also get you access to a counselor who speaks English to help you navigate things such as culture shock or loneliness and other issues that might arise due to being abroad. And they're also going to list some resources for U.S. residents, which include the RAIN, RAINN, sexual assault hotline, and the U.S. State Department resources. There's the Office of Overseas Citizen Services at 1-888-407-4747. If you'd like to take a photo of this screen or screenshot it, and be a good idea. But I do recommend, if this is a concern of yours, depending on the country you're going to, the city, or how you're feeling, to reach out to your program and talk with them about this.
Yeah. And so there are Tulane resources still available to you. You are going through our office. You are still a Tulane student while you are abroad. So all of the standard resources, CAPS, the line, SAFE, case management, and success coaching are available to you. It is usually easiest to use your program provider provided resources, especially trying to find CAPS is kind of in like this gray line where telehealth is in question mark legality. But your program provider, more than likely either has an in-country therapist who speaks English and can work with you, or they have someone who works exclusively to provide mental health support for their programs. So in-country resources are usually going to be the easiest. Talking to your program, your academic director, your professors, of just, hey, how do you manage this? Is always going to be helpful. But we do want you to know that you are still a Tulane student. We are always happy to connect you with Tulane resources. Maybe you don't feel like you can take that step. You can always reach out to our office, your advisor, any one of us, to kind of talk about, hey, how do I work with this? So back to the chat.
Yes. Okay. So were there any things that stood out to you? Do you have any new thoughts about gender at home or abroad? Again, you can type in the chat or come off of mute. Yeah, if you just want to even just type a quick sentence about something that you learned, or something that a new thought that you had about street harassment, let us know. We'd love to hear your responses and get some feedback. We need at least one person to respond, to move on. So, okay, awesome. So Abby Evans wrote, I think that having resources is so important because this can happen anywhere, at home or abroad. Correct. So, Tulane resources, and study abroad resources in from your program. I definitely encourage you to check out um, your program's preventative measures, and just to like learn more about their resources ahead of time, so that if something were to happen to you or a friend, you know where to go, and you know what kind of resources to seek out.
Yeah, and I've given this presentation, many, many times over the course of my tenure, and I always think differently every single time. And so we always wish we didn't have to give this PDO, but it was because a student requested it, and she said that she really wished she had been given kind of an honest conversation before she went. And so we want this to be that honest conversation with you. We're always happy to do one-on-one conversations as well. You can talk with any of us. We are always here for you, thanks to Zoom, to have one-on-one conversations while you're there, whether it's about just general culture shock or street harassment culture shock or general anything. So this is the QR code. This is how we're tracking attendance. Please do this.
Hmm.
Um, and let's see what else. Kat, actually, if you have the link for it and you could put it in the chat just in case some people are on their phones and need to.
Yes, I was just thinking about that. Let me pull up the link. Give me a second.
But yeah, so in general, like I said, we're always happy to discuss with you. Obviously, we all love study abroad for its warts and all. This is gender and street harassment. You can just pick the old date since this one was the rescheduled one. If you pick the most recent date, I think that would be like end of March.
Yeah, you can. It's March 29th, 7 p.m. Street harassment and gender in a global context. You can
Yeah,
choose that one.
March 29th.
I'm just gonna drop it in the chat in a second for people who don't have it. Just give me 1 second. Let me pull it up on here. Oh, Sienna, I can't minimize my screen because I'm recording. So if you wanna, let me send you the link.
Okay.
I just sent it to your email.
Hopefully y'all do not see my inbox.
And if you filled it out on your phone, you can go ahead and leave, and we'll have that link in the chat in a second for people who are unable to pull it up on their phone. And thank you all for attending. Okay, and Sienna just posted it in the chat for those of you who are waiting for that. Just make sure you fill that out. That's how we're tracking your attendance. And we'll have 2 more PDO sessions next week. Sienna, do you have the date on the top of your head by any chance for living like a local?
Off the top of my head,
I
no.
believe it's next Wednesday.
I can pull it up.
And I'm gonna stop recording as well.